in the shattered remnants of civilization, where the only sound that broke the monotony of death was the occasional shuffle of walkers or the all-too-familiar cry of someone claiming their first or last kill. Hope had become a foreign concept. And yet, hope was exactly what Rick Grimes carried tucked into his pocket like a souvenir too precious to leave behind. His gaze hardened against the scalding Georgia sun as the group neared the gates of Terminus. The painted banners were bright against the barren backdrop of the world they'd survived. Words promising sanctuary, safety, and salvation. "End of the line," Abraham muttered, breaking the lingering silence. His usual stoicism faltered, betraying the faintest flicker of belief. They shared it with one another, hesitant and fragile, a sense of possibility. After days of hunger chewing at their stomachs and mistrust threatening to unravel the seams of their group, the allure of a haven, of meat roasting on open flames and walls devoid of walker scratches, it felt damn near like a miracle. Rick's fingers twitched around the handle of his revolver. His brow furrowed. He'd been burned too many times before, fire licking away at his trust, each betrayal a gnarled scar on his battered resolve. But Carl was looking at him, those pale blue eyes of his carrying some shred of the child he used to be. "Dad," Carl whispered, just loud enough for Rick to hear but quiet enough to betray his fear of disappointment. It could really be something. Rick's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He turned to his people, his family. "We don't relax our guard," he said firmly. His words were a lifeline of caution cast over a sea of hope. "We don't lower our weapons until we know." There were nods of agreement, from Glenn, Maggie, Daryl, Michonne, and the others. But behind that, beneath the strength they presented to one another, there was something else. A kindling of relief, a yearning for everything Terminus promised to be. The gates creaked open, revealing smiles instead of sneers. The Terminus residents stood just inside, their faces untouched by malice, their hands raised to show they bore no weapons. A tall man with gentle eyes stepped forward to greet them, his voice calm and steady like water over river stones. "Name's Gareth," he said, the way one might extend a handshake in the time before everything turned to ash. "You must have had a hell of a time finding your way here." Rick studied him for a long moment, his instincts prickling underneath his skin like the sting of 1,000 spider bites. But Gareth didn't flinch under the weight of his scrutiny. Behind him, others carried trays of steaming food, their laughter ringing out like bells. A sound so foreign it clawed at Rick's defenses. "You feed everyone who shows up here?" Rick asked, his tone flat but cautious. Gareth offered a soft smile. "Not everyone stays, if that's what you're getting at. But we believe that what's left of humanity doesn't have to be all chaos. We've got rules and we all contribute. Nobody freeloads for long. You work, you eat, you stay safe. That's how it is." "We've heard promises like that before," Michonne said, voice sharp and wise in a way that cut through Gareth's warmth like a cold wind. "I understand," Gareth replied without missing a beat. "After what the world's become, it's hard to trust. But the question isn't whether we can trust you. It's whether you're willing to let yourself trust us." The words landed heavier than Rick expected, hanging in the humid air like the distant groans of a walker herd. The aroma of real, fresh food wafted through the open space, stirring a hunger that went far beyond the physical. Gareth didn't push them, simply backed away a step, gesturing openly to the fires burning in the cooking pits, the gardens lining the fences, and the sleeping quarters that appeared untouched by violence. Rick gave the slightest nod. If this was a mask, they'd find the face underneath soon enough. The next morning, Rick woke to the sound of Carl laughing. Not a bitter laugh or one born of disbelief, but an actual laugh, the kind he hadn't heard from his son in months. The boy was sitting in the grass, talking to a kid from Terminus near his own age. Something about it made Rick's chest ache, like he was mourning Carl's childhood while it stood right in front of him. Terminus wasn't perfect. Rick would be the first to say that. But in the hours and the days that followed, they began to settle. The people here worked hard to keep things running smoothly. Walkers weren't an immediate issue. There were systems in place to keep the dead outside the walls, and survivors pitched in to reinforce the defenses. Rick split watch duty with Daryl, The two of them spent the evenings perched on the highest walkway along the fence, pretending not to notice how the air was tinged with the scent of flowers from one of the nearby gardens. "We let this place get too cozy, could turn us soft," Daryl muttered one evening, leaning heavily on his crossbow. Rick nodded in agreement, but his shoulders were less tense now, his voice free of that constant edge. "Just 'cause it feels safe don't mean we forget what's out there." Daryl grunted, but neither of them called anyone to leave. Herschel's words still echoed faintly in Rick's mind, and he hated the way they nestled somewhere close to hope. "You've got to keep on trying. As long as there's a chance, that's what keeps you human." As the weeks stretched into months, the group became woven into Terminus's fabric. Maggie and Glenn took up tasks in the gardens, learning to till the soil for crops that would grow even in such harsh conditions. Carol, sensing the tension within herself softening, found comfort in the kitchen, baking bread for the first time in years. Michonne taught the residents close quarters combat, offering her expertise with the katana to anyone willing to learn. Even Sasha, who rarely showed her more vulnerable side, could be heard joking softly with a few of the residents. This place was giving them something they hadn't experienced in years, something dangerously close to peace. But Rick's unsettled instincts remained. The quiet had unnerved him long before the world fell apart, and here it was, reappearing to lean heavily on his shoulders like an unwelcome guest. He began to notice little things he hadn't at first. The way some of Gareth's people talked in low, clipped tones when they thought no one was listening. The way food, despite its abundance, was meted out with an almost imperceptible level of calculation. It all exploded one late afternoon during a regular shift at the gates. Walkers had pressed against the fences harder than usual, and Abraham volunteered to oversee the defense crew as they reinforced the outer perimeter. Rick stood nearby, monitoring from his usual post until he noticed something strange. One of Gareth's people circling the sidewall instead of attending to the attacking herd. Rick's movements were swift, quiet. He followed the man and watched as he deliberately disabled one of the alarms designed to warn of breaches. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Rick demanded, stepping from the shadows. The man froze, but his eyes didn't fill with guilt. Instead, they twisted into something darker. "You've been here long enough," he said, his voice low. "You thought this was all about welcoming everyone? There's a reason this place hasn't fallen. Just think about it. Everything comes at a price." The words rippled through Rick like the first crack of thunder before a storm. For the first time in months, the cold reality beyond Terminus's gates weighed down on him once more. When the alarm sounded later that evening, conspicuously late for such a large herd, it wasn't just the walkers pressing on the group's sense of safety. A new dread crept in, even as Gareth's voice rang out over the chaos with orders to defend the walls. Rick's group moved quickly, their instincts still sharp, but some part of him couldn't shake the smell of something rotten beneath the surface of Terminus. Safe havens always had shadows, and Rick was beginning to realize they hadn't been looking closely enough. Rick tightened his grip on his revolver as shadows lengthened across Terminus. The alarms blared intermittently now, a choked, uneven wailing that rattled the nerves more than it warned. The walker herd was large, but not impossibly so. They'd faced worse before. What nagged at Rick wasn't the walkers. It was the gnawing suspicion that the sound of the alarm wasn't the only thing being choked. Daryl had caught his unease when they'd returned from the perimeter. "Something's got you more twisted than usual," he said, his voice low as they secured a walkway along the west side of the fence. Rick's gaze scanned the area, his words tight and clipped. "That guy by the alarm today, he was tampering with it. Not by accident." Daryl muttered a curse under his breath, steadying his crossbow as another walker staggered into view. "Could have told you this place was too good to be true." "What now?" Rick shook his head. That was the question, wasn't it? The problem wasn't just Gareth or one loose thread. It was the whole fabric of Terminus, too neatly woven to have been untouched by the apocalypse. "We watch first. Figure out who's pulling the strings." The words felt bitter on his tongue. Watching had never been Rick's strength. He was a man of action, strike before being struck. But too much hung in the balance. If Gareth's people really were hiding something, the consequences of acting too soon could end with Carl, Judith, and the others buried in graves they didn't dig. As the chaos of the Walker breach settled into a vaguely controlled rhythm, Rick's group slipped into their roles like well-worn gloves. Maggie and Glenn maneuvered through the chaos, ensuring the younger and older residents of Terminus were inside safe zones. Sasha and Abraham held firm at key choke points, their fight honed by days and nights of desperate battles. If there was one thing Rick's group excelled at, it was surviving. But survival alone wouldn't help them untangle the web Gareth had spun. While screams rang out near the fences, Rick's mind remained anchored elsewhere. He couldn't stop replaying every interaction with Gareth, with his people, with the faces that always seemed too clean, too confident for a world like this. They'd been allowed to keep the illusion for too long. Later that night, when the perimeter settled and Terminus exhaled what passed as a collective sigh of relief, Rick pulled Michonne aside. She'd been helping stitch up a young boy grazed by some bad luck during the breach. But the moment she saw Rick's expression, her hands stilled. He brought her to the far corner of the compound, near the south wall where the garden tools were kept. There, with only the dim glow of a sparse lantern illuminating their faces, Rick laid out what he'd seen and what he suspected. If this place doesn't fall to walkers, it's because someone decided it shouldn't, Rick said, his voice edging into that low, commanding tone he adopted when survival meant trusting your gut. That guy by the alarm today, he wasn't caught off guard. He wanted those alarms dead until it was too late. Michonne's jaw tightened, her fingers flexing against the hilt of her katana. And Gareth? You think he knows? Or you think he's pulling the strings? Rick shook his head, frustration shadowing his features. I don't know, but his people aren't all on the same page, that much is clear. Michonne leaned against the wall, her gaze narrowing into the kind of steel Rick had come to trust more than anything. We need intel. Daryl could follow someone out. Carol might be able to sweet-talk her way into their circle. Rick allowed himself a half-smirk at the thought. Carol, who everyone always underestimated. They'd never see her coming. His face darkened immediately after. But we're running out of time. If this place turns out to be what I think it is. Michonne leaned closer, her voice sharp but low. Then we burn it down before the flames touch us. The following days tested their nerves in ways none of them had expected. Whatever veneer Terminus had maintained now felt calculated, deliberate. Gareth doubled down on his friendly demeanor, his voice growing louder when he joked with the group, his smiles more frequent, too frequent. Carol noticed he watched Rick often, as though waiting to see what his reactions might reveal. It was Glenn who brought the first piece of undeniable evidence straight to Rick. I was checking out the supply depot near the east gate, Glenn said quietly, kneeling beside Rick as they repaired a section of the garden fence. There's something off about the inventory sheets. Too much food going somewhere, but not here. Rick's hands slowed their work, his eyes cutting upward. You sure? Glenn nodded, glancing toward the nearby Terminus workers who pretended not to listen, but didn't seem particularly good at hiding it. Positive. They've got more than just gardens keeping this place alive. But whatever it is, they don't want everyone to know. That was when the floodgates broke. By the end of the week, everyone in Rick's group had uncovered one thread or another that didn't sit right. Maggie overheard discussions about selective rotations on some kind of special duty outside the walls. Carol caught fleeting glimpses of Gareth and his men heading into a reinforced section of the compound where no one else was allowed. Even Tyrese, always the voice of stubborn optimism, admitted he'd started avoiding Terminus residents who whispered too much and smiled too little. It all came to a head one night when Rick, Daryl, and Michonne decided to follow Gareth. They waited until the compound began to settle into uneasy quiet, residents retreating to their bunks, weary from a long day of rebuilding, and slipped through the shadows like stray cats avoiding a leash. Gareth led them to the back of the compound, where that reinforced building loomed wide and silent, always guarded, always locked. Tonight, however, the guards weren't stationed outside but rather had slipped inside, and the faint flicker of light through the cracks in the wooden slats told them whatever was happening was still going on. Michonne exchanged a glance with Rick. She mouthed the words, "We move fast," and that's exactly what they did. Daryl dispatched the door lock with practiced efficiency, and the three of them slipped inside, finding themselves in a room colder than the night air outside. The stench hit them first: brine, blood, and the humid stink of decay. Then they saw what Terminus really was. Rows of dismembered human remains hung like trophies on steel hooks, cold and lifeless despite the obvious care taken to clean the room of walker contamination. The meat wasn't meant for the walkers at all. Rick felt his chest tighten as his gaze snapped between tables, trays, butchered bodies wrapped in neat plastic bundles. His stomach churned, but his survival instincts surged ahead of the sickness stabbing at his gut. "They're feeding us," Michonne hissed, her voice low and venomous. Daryl took a shaky step backward, his breathing uneven as he muttered, "Son of a bitch." They didn't have time to process further. Voices echoed down the corridor just beyond the far wall. One of them Gareth's, calm, utterly undisturbed. Rick gave a furious nod toward the door they came through, locking gazes with both of his companions. They moved without hesitation, retreating to the cover of darkness outside and running the moment the door clicked shut behind them. Back at their camp within the compound walls, Rick's rage filled the room like another person entirely. He paced furiously, the others watching with wide eyes as Michonne explained what they'd seen in cold, clipped detail. Sasha was the first to speak. "We leave tonight." "And go where?" Abraham shot back, his voice tinged with its usual confidence but not entirely free of doubt. "The world's no different outside these walls." Rick halted in his tracks. His gaze swept across his family, the faces that had been through hell and clawed their way back every time. "We're not just leaving," Rick growled. "We're taking this place down. Every last one of them." Carol's voice was steady. "And if some of them don't know? If they're not part of it?" Rick's hardened expression shifted for a fraction of a second. Regret, hesitation. Then it was gone. "We give them the chance to run, but we don't take chances otherwise. This ends here." Somewhere outside, the sun dipped below the treeline, shadowing Terminus in a darkness that felt almost possessive. The promise of safety not only shattered but revealed as a weapon forged in blood. Rick glanced toward the door, his jaw clenched, his voice low. "We hit them hard. We hit them fast. And we don't stop until this place is ash." Their unspoken pact settled heavily between them. The time for trust was gone. Rick's voice weighed heavier than the Georgia night air, settling over the group like a decree carved into stone. They'd faced monsters before, but this was something darker. Not stupidity or desperation. This was deliberate, methodical. Terminus wasn't surviving the apocalypse. It was thriving on it, soaking its roots in the blood of innocence. And now, that same blood was on their hands, dripping through the cracks of their trust. The group moved like a single, fractured organism. They'd done this dance before, and by now survival had become something of a cruel diligence. Daryl slung his crossbow tight across his back, his jaw set in that grim, unshakable way Rick had come to depend on. Glenn and Maggie whispered in hurried, clipped tones, preparing supplies. Sasha's hands were steady as she prepped her rifle, her eyes sharp and hollow. Carol stood apart, a quiet force watching over them all. No longer a victim of circumstance, but its judge and executor. "I'll take the west end," Carol said softly once the preparations were nearly finished. There was no emotion wrapped around her words, no hesitation or fear, just the calm control of a woman who had made her peace with crossing lines long ago. "If we can cut off their power, it might give us the upper hand." Rick nodded, his eyes meeting hers for a beat longer than anyone else's. He didn't need to tell her to be careful. She wouldn't be. "Daryl, Glenn, you come with me," Rick continued, already sketching out the twisted map of Terminus in his mind. "We hit the mess hall first. That's where they'll be expecting us. Michonne and Sasha. We take the north quarters," Michonne said, her voice colder than the steel of her katana. Her gaze flickered toward Sasha, who gave a firm, silent nod of her own. "If there are innocents, we'll find them. That was the unspoken hope hollowing out the room. They weren't all monsters. Or at least they prayed they weren't. It took less than 20 minutes for the plan to come together, but the weight of it stretched for hours. Judith stared up at Rick from her makeshift crib, her tiny hand reaching out as if it could somehow catch the pieces of him still human. Carl sat next to her, his hat tilted low over his face, concealing the storm behind his eyes. "Dad." Rick froze. Of all the words Carl could have thrown at him, that one syllable carried more weight than an accusation or a plea. It wasn't the bow. Why asking permission or voicing disagreement? It was just him, not a soldier or survivor, but a kid, a son. Rick turned, his shadow long and sharp against the dim lantern light. "You stay with Judith," Rick said firmly, kneeling down so they were eye to eye. His voice softened, though his resolve remained ironclad. "I need you to keep her safe, no matter what happens out there." Carl frowned. "And what if you don't come back?" There wasn't anger behind the question, just devastating honesty. Rick swallowed hard, forcing some semblance of steadiness into his tone. "Then you do what I've always taught you. You survive, Carl. You protect her. You understand me?" Carl nodded, though the motion was reluctant, mutinous. Rick placed a hand on his son's shoulder, squeezing it tightly before rising to his feet. The night seemed to hold its breath as they set off, a strange stillness wrapping itself around Terminus like fog before a storm. The group dispersed into shadows, becoming part of the darkness itself. Carol slipped away first, vanishing like a ghost into the west perimeter. Sasha and Michonne moved in tandem, their silhouettes blending with the faint hum of the compound's generators. Daryl stayed close to Rick as they approached the mess hall entrance. The comforting weight of the revolver sat heavy in Rick's palm, while Daryl's crossbow tracked every shadow like a predator searching for prey. Glenn lagged toward the rear, his breathing controlled but shallow, the tension obvious in the tightness of his steps. Before Rick opened the door, Glenn whispered, "Do you think they even believe they're wrong? That what they're doing is evil?" Rick glanced back, his face unreadable. "Does it matter?" Glenn hesitated, his brow knotting as he wrestled with the question that didn't have an answer. "I don't know." Neither did Rick. The mess hall was filled with the same grotesque cheerfulness Rick had come to loathe. Long tables stretched out beneath lanterns that swung faintly from chains, the flickering light illuminating Gareth and 4 of his core men, all mid-conversation. Plates were piled high with food that now made Rick's stomach churn faster than his hunger. Human meat had a stink to it, not in smell but in understanding, and Rick swore it was like he could taste it in the air. Daryl raised his crossbow before Rick could even give the signal, but Rick held up a hand, his body going rigid. Not yet. Timing was everything. Too early, and Gareth's people would scatter, exposing the group to whatever contingencies Terminus had in place. Too late. Well, Rick didn't intend to let it go that far. "You've seen the way they've settled in," Gareth was saying, oblivious to the hunters circling his hunting lodge. His voice oozed with self-assured calm, grounded in a belief more unshakable than bricks and mortar. "We're giving them what they need, even if they'll never admit it. You strip away all their self-righteousness, and they do what we did in a heartbeat. Difference is, we're not afraid to look the truth in the eye." Daryl tensed beside Rick, his knuckles whitening around the grip of the crossbow. "I got a bolt with his name on it," he muttered under his breath. Rick's jaw tightened. Quiet had never been Daryl's strong suit, but for now, they needed patience. Every second stretched unbearably thin, the words coming out of Gareth's mouth a kind of music Rick felt sick for recognizing. How easily a man could justify anything. How easily the voice of a devil speaking calm could sound like percents of reason. The moment came almost too fast to register. One of Gareth's men got up to fetch another drink, moving toward the front entrance. That was all the distraction Rick needed. He stepped into the opening, his revolver raised, shadow cutting sharp lines over the room's soft glow. "Drop it," Rick growled. The silence that followed was deafening. Gareth didn't flinch. If anything, his smile widened, his expression calm even with the barrel of Rick's revolver fixed between his eyes. His men froze, but their gazes darted toward the places Rick knew kept knives or makeshift weapons close at hand. "Well, look who's been paying attention," Gareth said with infuriating patience. "Don't tell me you're surprised, Rick. You didn't really believe this world had anything left to offer besides sacrifice, did you?" Rick's finger twitched against the trigger. He wanted nothing more than to end Gareth's sermon then and there, but he needed answers first. Answers Gareth was too smug to keep to himself. "I've seen monsters take many forms," Rick said, his voice low and steady. "But you tell me, is this survival, what you're doing, or satisfaction?" Gareth's smile stayed in place, though his eyes gleamed ominously in the faint light. "Survival isn't about the method, Rick. It's about the result. People like you, people who clawed their way here after losing everything, you know that better than anyone. You call us monsters, but isn't that the pot calling the kettle black? How many people have you killed to protect the ones you love?" A cold silence slipped through the room, thick as syrup. Gareth didn't press closer but leaned casually against the edge of the table, his confidence weaponized. "Difference is," Rick said, his voice now weighted by a menace as dark as anything Terminus could conjure. "The people we buried deserved graves. Yours won't." Before Rick could stop him, Daryl loosed the first shot. The bolt embedded itself in the throat of one of Gareth's henchmen with a sharp, wet thunk. Chaos erupted in a heartbeat. Plates clattered to the floor, chairs overturned, and Gareth moved fast. Too fast for a man who'd seemed so at ease moments before. Rick squeezed the trigger and fired, his ears ringing as his shot grazed Gareth's shoulder but failed to bring him down. The man darted behind a table, barking orders. His voice rang out, louder now, angrier but no less composed. "Seal the doors. Don't let them out alive." Rick's mind raced. He knew it had come to this. It always did. There was no escaping violence anymore. The hope Terminus had dangled in front of them had burned away, but in its place stood something stronger, resolve. As Gareth's people reached for weapons hidden beneath the tables, Glenn shoved one of them back, tackling him to the ground while struggling to disarm him. Maggie appeared through the far doorway, raising her pistol to fire a clear shot at an armed figure charging from the north hall. Rick advanced toward Gareth, his focus razor-sharp despite the chaos unfolding around him. Daryl handled the others with ruthless efficiency, his crossbow firing arrows faster than Terminus's guards could register them. But Gareth didn't scramble. He made no desperate last attempts to escape. Instead, he smiled one last time, his eyes alight with something between satisfaction and pity. "You think killing me changes anything? You're the same as us," he said, that eerie calm never wavering, even as Rick pressed his revolver to Gareth's temple. "The difference," Rick hissed, his voice ice and flame, "is that you enjoyed it." He fired. The silence that followed was almost as jarring as the gunfire and shouts that had preceded it. It wasn't over yet, they all knew that. But with Gareth slumped on the ground and what remained of his men scattered or captured, it felt like daylight was starting to claw its way through the dark. Rick's shoulders heaved with ragged breaths as he lowered his weapon. Blood stained his hands, proof that what little humanity Terminus had promised was nothing but another lie. Behind him, Daryl touched a hand to Rick's shoulder, steadying but free of words. They'd survive, like always, but whatever hope Terminus had teased was gone now, replaced with a grim taste in their mouths. The cost of trusting the wrong people, Rick thought bitterly. Safety wasn't real. And sanctuary? Sanctuary always had a price.